Удобные исторические теории. Простые, стройные, известные каждому со школы. Будут опровергнуты. Забытая история.
Our guest is the president of the Foundation for Support and Development of the New Chronology, Boris Kotovich. Boris, hello.
Hello.
What is the origin of the world?
Sure, I will explain everything now. I just wanted to say why I'm doing this today. The guests of this program listed many different facts, but how are they connected? In general, if you don't read our books, it's unclear. That's why today I would like to talk about the connection between key events in the history of the world according to the New Chronology. Despite the fact that the New Chronology has a deeply tiered system of arguments, today I will not produce any proofs. I will just list these key events and draw attention to some facts that have become clearer to me thanks to the New Chronology. One of the most important discoveries of the New Chronology is the fact that until the beginning of the 17th century, there was only one empire on Earth. In order to understand how this could have happened, we have to go back to the 6th–9th centuries of the Common Era, that is, 1400 to 1100 years ago, when, according to the New Chronology, modern human civilization was just beginning to emerge. There were still few people on Earth, literally tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. They were dispersed along the equator, living in primitive communal system, engaged in hunting, fishing, and gathering. Let's consider a hypothetical situation. A stronger tribe claims the territory where another tribe lives. What should the chief do? There are two options. The first option is to resist and, given the severity of primitive times, expose the entire tribe to the risk of complete annihilation.
To fight, you mean?
Yes. And the second option is to retreat to unexplored territories, of which there are many, and continue hunting, fishing, and gathering there. Most likely, a wise chief will choose the second option, from which it follows that when there are many territories, and when engaging in hunting, fishing, and gathering, the concept of native land does not exist.
What about the instinct of self-preservation, defending your ground?
If there are many territories, then precisely because of the instinct of self-preservation, we move to another territory.
But we don't know what's there.
We do know what's there. We sent scouts.
Ah, I see.
But in any case, here is death, while there is still some more positive uncertainty. And when does a person need to defend their native land? When they start farming. In this case, they are forced to defend either the unharvested crop, or the harvested crop, or some labor-saving tools, mills, or irrigation system, or some reserves that they have. In general, when agriculture arises, then the defense of the native land starts, and the concept of native land arises. Can a gatherer become a farmer? The traditional history says, not a big deal. If you get tired of going to the forest for various vegetables and fruits, take them, plant them all around your house, and be a farmer. In general, there are several studies that say it wasn't that simple. In particular, this is outlined in Mr. Sklyarov's article. But to illustrate the absurdity of this version, let's take a look at ourselves. In the forests near Moscow, blueberries grow, cranberries grow in the swamps, mushrooms grow. Somehow, we don't cultivate any of this near our house. Why? Because it's easier to go to the forest and gather the necessary amount from vast plantations than to grow all this for a whole year at home, and also face the risk of crop failure, God forbid.
But in some places, this is successfully cultivated.
Somewhere they do, but nevertheless, we prefer to grow what doesn't grow in our forests: potatoes, cucumbers, tomatoes, and so on.
But they do grow strawberries.
Well, it's still different. It's hybrid strawberries. And if you took it from the forest and brought it home, you would grow the same thing because it is pollinated from the forest. The same thing that grows in the forest. You won't be able to grow any hybrid strawberries. So, for a gatherer to become a farmer, some special conditions must arise, under which he can survive only as a farmer. But is there such a place on Earth where such conditions exist? It turns out there is. It's the valley of the Nile River. The Nile, as is known, floods and for 2 to 3 months drives all living things to a narrow strip of oasis, where there is little vegetation. Accordingly, gathering cannot feed a large number of people. There's little vegetation, few animals, so hunting won't feed them either, and fishing is hindered by the flooded river. Therefore, the only way to survive in this oasis strip is to come to it with reserves of food and fuel. Is it possible to create food and fuel reserves in the Nile River Valley? It turns out, yes, it's possible too. The Nile brings fertile silt to its banks, in which wild cereals growing nearby can be planted without plowing. And by the time of the next flood, you will have food and fuel reserves. Fuel is straw, food is grain. And as we remember, when man starts farming, the need to defend arises. When such a need arises, armed professional units must appear to withstand at least the initial onslaught of enemies until the militia gathers. If armed, designated professional units appear, they need to be fed. This gives rise to a taxation system, controlled to ensure everyone pays, some punitive system. Also, the Nile floods periodically, and to understand this periodicity, one needs to observe the stars, which gives birth to astronomy. And to ensure that the results of observations are not lost, they need to be recorded, giving birth to writing. And all this together gives rise to the birth of the first and only state on the banks of the Nile. Specifically, the first and only one, because it's precisely there that conditions exist for the emergence of agriculture. What happens next is that around us roam tribes living in primitive communal system, vast territories where agriculture could also be practiced, but where no one practices it. This Nile state has an advantage, one might say, organizational weaponry. They already have a state, while all the others do not possess such weapons, such organizational structure. Therefore, this Nile state began to spread and gradually turned into an empire, capturing the shores of the Mediterranean and Black Seas. The first capital, naturally. This is according to the new chronology version.
I hear you, of course.
Obviously, the first capital was on the banks of the Nile River. This is the first Rome or ancient Rome, as it was called by the authors of the new chronology. And I would like to draw attention to the fact that Rome is not the name of a city. It's a term meaning the center of religious and administrative authority. Therefore, there were many Romes. In the perception of the modern person, Rome is one in Italy, but in reality, before the appearance of Italian Rome, there were many Romes. So, the first Rome was on the Nile River. After the coasts of the two seas were settled, the capital was relocated to the geographic center.
What century is this?
It's approximately the 10th century.
So, it turns out that 6 centuries have passed?
It's unknown because we don't really know what happened before the 11th, 12th century. There was almost no writing or chronicles at that time. The chronicles began in the 12th century. I will talk about that now. First, a few words about the second capital. The second capital was located on the Bosporus. This is the second Rome. We also know this Rome by the names Byzantium, Tsargrad, Rome, as well as Jerusalem and Troy. This is all the same city that has survived to this day. I will talk about it a little later, but naturally, no one lives in it now. As I said, before the 12th century, there were no chronicles as such. And some more or less detailed records of what was happening in the empire began only in the 12th century. One of the first events that was described in detail was a wedding. The groom was a member of the imperial family, a person entitled to claim the imperial throne but not occupying it, holding the highest title in the empire after the emperor, Sebastocrator. And the bride was a girl from a distant province, from the banks of the Volga, from near the city of Galich and Kostroma. From a good royal, but not imperial family. The girl's name was Maria, and the groom's name was Isaac Komnenos, but he is better known to us by his gospel name Joseph. The wedding of Mary and Joseph, the wedding of the Holy Family, took place somewhere on the banks of the Volga. Most likely, later, the city of Yaroslavl was founded at this holy place. During this wedding, Joseph engaged in a staged struggle with a bear and defeated it. The bear was either tied up or fastened, it's difficult to tell now, so victory was achieved.
An interesting point, Boris. What algorithms do you use? I understand that essentially you are now telling the gospel, but according to the new chronology.
Yes, of course.
What algorithms did you use to determine that it happened exactly like this, and not like we know it?
I suggest reading books on this topic to understand how it works in the new chronology. First, the correct dating of certain events is established, and then we look at the main characters in that period of time, according to the correct dates.
And what is the correct dating?
The correct dating is calculated using astronomy, using mathematics. You need to read about this in detail in the books. For example, if we were to discuss the Gospel in detail, It would take one, maybe even two programs. So, with your permission, I will skip ahead from this point. As promised, today I won't produce proofs, but will simply tell you how it really happened. So, the Battle of Joseph with the bear. In memory of this event, on the coat of arms of Yaroslavl, we see a bear, and on the coat of arms of another city, we see Joseph killing a beast, or rather, St. George the Victorious, as we now say, killing a dragon. They celebrated the wedding and set off for the husband's homeland. On the way, in Bethlehem, modern-day Bethlehem is the Cape Violet in Crimea, a boy was born, whom they named Andronikos. To this day, the cave church of the Nativity of Christ is located at the site of this boy's birth at Cape Violet. It turns out that the boy was a member of the imperial family, a person who could claim the imperial throne. But the ruling emperor at that time, known as Manuel Komnenos, whom we know better by his gospel name Herod, had other plans regarding the succession to the throne. Therefore, the boy's life was threatened. And, as we know, the Holy Family was warned about this threat by the Magi. From this threat the Holy Family fled to the banks of the Volga, under the protection of the relatives of the Virgin Mary, where the boy Andronikos, subsequently posthumously named Jesus Christ, that is, the crucified Messiah, spent almost his entire conscious life. There's one thing I didn't mention. The boy was born in Bethlehem, according to the new chronology in the year 1152, and in 1182, he became the emperor of this sole empire. Like any high-ranking official, he began to surround himself with people he trusted. Naturally, since he spent most of his life on the Volga, these people were from the Volga. In addition, in the empire, he carried out a series of reforms, the main motto of which was, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's, and no one else can have any claims against you." All of this together, these reforms and the replacement of the local Bosporus people with Volga people at the center of the empire, led to the local Bosporus nobility losing significant income. All of this led to a conspiracy, and in the year 1185, Jesus Andronikos was overthrown and crucified.
Alexander Feldman asks, aren't there rivers similar to the Nile in the interfluves between India and China?
There probably are, but the ideal conditions exist only on the banks of the Nile.
910th. How come you're not paying attention to cuneiform and Egyptian inscriptions?
Read books on the new chronology. Unfortunately, I can't talk in detail about this topic right now.
The listeners are interested.
I understand. I believe that Gleb Nosovsky will eventually answer all these questions. We will have several more programs, and we will be able to discuss this topic in detail. Right now, my task is to briefly outline the history of the world.
Still, our listeners' questions.
Certainly, that's important, but then I simply won't have time. We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes left at the end, and during that time, I'll try to answer these questions.
Please continue.
I continue. In 1185, the execution of Jesus took place. I would like to draw attention to three things that made a strong impression on me. First, on the banks of the Bosporus, there still exists a city that has survived practically under its original name. It's called the Fortress of Yeros, practically Jerusalem. Next to this Fortress of Yeros is a mountain called Beykoz, and on it, as local tour guides say, is the tomb of Saint Yusha Savior. In fact, this is Jerusalem and the mountain is the place of crucifixion. If you look at ancient depictions, you can see that this is how the crucifixion was depicted. A large river, on the right bank of the river, we see a medieval city, and not far from this city, 2 or 3 kilometers away, we see a mountain where the crucifixion took place. That's the first detail. The second detail. Usually, a trial begins with the introduction of the parties to the process. The judge such and such, the defendant such and such. Probably, the only trial where this was not done was the trial of Jesus Christ. When Pontius Pilate, instead of introducing the defendant, said, "Behold the man." And we are now told that this was a very profound phrase, and how much he wanted to convey with these 3 words. But in reality, Pontius Pilate most likely did introduce the defendant, calling him by the name Andronikos. But since in Greek, andros means man, and Andronikos is a related word, apparently, in translation from Greek, either intentionally or accidentally, the meaning of what Pontius Pilate did was forgotten.
What's the meaning?
He introduced the defendant by his given name, Andronikos. And the third detail, which I would also like to draw attention to, Pontius Pilate ordered a plaque to be placed on the cross that read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." We are told that this inscription was mocking, and that the mockery supposedly lies in the word king. But since, thanks to the new chronology, we now know that Jesus was most likely a king in the empire, an emperor, then the mockery lies in another word. That word is Jews. Jew, translated into Russian, means one who glorifies God, practically a Slav. In Russia, on crosses, you can still find the inscription, Tsar of Glory, and on ancient crosses from the 14th–16th centuries, you can see the inscription, Tsar of Slavs, Tsar of Slavin. So, this plaque on the cross described why Jesus was killed after all. He was killed because he was a foreign king, not ours, not from the Bosporus. He was the king of the Slavs, the king of the barbarians. Let's continue the conversation. Everything was just fine with Jesus' relatives. The empire had practically come under their control. They had their own emperor, their officials in the empire, and then not only was their emperor and relative deposed, but also killed. Naturally, there was a need for revenge for this. Troops were gathered on the banks of the Volga, which set off on a crusade, and in 1204 they captured Jerusalem. By the way, I didn't mention that, according to the new chronology, Christ was crucified in 1185. In 1204, Christ was avenged. About the 1204 campaign, we are told that it was the Fourth Crusade. I would like to dwell on it because if we critically approach what is written about the Fourth Crusade, it becomes quite ludicrous. So, the Crusaders gathered to liberate Jerusalem from Muslims. They gathered on an island near Venice, and asked Venetian merchants to provide them with ships to take them to Jerusalem. For this work, the merchants asked for 20 tons of silver. The Crusaders said, "We don't have that kind of money." "Well then, you will capture a Christian city for us." But the Pope of Rome forbids capturing Christian cities. "It's okay, we'll make a deal." They captured a city called Zadar. Strange name, but it seems to symbolize how much they were paid after capturing the city. Nothing was paid. And they say, "You know, you captured one city, well done. Now capture Constantinople for us, and we'll provide you with a fleet." The Crusaders captured Constantinople. Moreover, surprisingly, according to the traditional version, at that time there were 200,000 inhabitants of Constantinople, and only 20,000 Crusaders. Not only that, they managed to capture this city of Constantinople twice. They first waited to be paid, then they weren't paid, and they captured the city again. Apparently, they received some loot, but they didn't go to Jerusalem. In general, strange things. I think this is such a fairy tale to explain what they were doing on the Bosporus after all. In the new chronology, everything is quite logical. If Jerusalem is located on the Bosporus, then you need to capture what is on the Bosporus. In the new chronology, there is only one crusade that ended in 1204. But, as we know, in traditional history, there are at least 10 crusades directed towards Jerusalem, successful, unsuccessful, different ones. There is also the Trojan War. The Trojan War and all the crusades are just one war that ended in 1204. They captured the city and started behaving as all conquerors do. They began to split the booty and share power. They got so carried away with this process that they plunged the empire into turmoil. The empire temporarily lost central control. As we remember, I already mentioned one of the names of the city, Troy. As is known, King Aeneas fled from Troy with his people and founded Rome. The authors of the new chronology carefully studied the path of King Aeneas and came to the conclusion that the version that he sailed to the Italian peninsula is incorrect.
Why?
There is a book, 500 pages. You should read the book about the journey of King Aeneas. In short, just one small argument. A modern cruise liner travels from Istanbul to Italian Rome in 14 days, calling at all major ports along the way. But it took King Aeneas 3.5 years to cover this relatively short distance. When, thanks to the new chronology, we find out and see where he actually went, it would be much more logical if he headed to the banks of the Volga. The thing is, the new chronology revealed that King Aeneas was called the brother of Jesus and the named son of the Virgin Mary, that is, their relative. During the turmoil that arose after the fall of Jerusalem, he went to the river Volga under the protection of his new relatives. This route, which requires crossing the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, and traveling up the Volga, could well take 3.5 years. As I have already said, at the site of the Holy Family's wedding, he founded a city known by the names Yaroslavl, Novgorod the Great, Yaroslav's court, and, of course, Rome. This is the third Rome. But this city did not become the Third Rome immediately. Being the most noble person in the interfluve of the Uka and Volga rivers, King Aeneas united the inhabitants of these territories under his rule. Partly with his authority, partly with armed forces, he managed to create a powerful state. Why powerful?
Huge resources, what Russia is still famous for.
Forests and rivers are full of all kinds of wildlife. People engage in slash and burn agriculture, which has proven its effectiveness.
As a result, exponential population growth was observed in this territory between the Uka and Volga rivers at that time. We are talking about the 13th century. In addition to this, a large amount of resources made it possible to widely spread iron processing. And in the Volga steppes, an infinite number of horses could be bred.
All this together enabled King Aeneas and his descendants to create a new type of army on this territory, a cavalry army armed with iron weapons, which were called Tatars. That is, at that time, Tatars were not a nationality, but the name of a caste of people engaged in warfare. These troops had many horses. Each warrior had 2 or 3 horses for moving the warrior, baggage, and weapons. Naturally, horses consume all the forage, so these units led a nomadic way of life out of necessity. Gradually, as they roamed, they settled the then uninhabited Europe. That is, this is the Great Migration of peoples. They also settled Asia, and subjugated to the Third Rome, Yaroslavl, all the places previously settled by the former empire. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the empire gradually developed, meaning cities were built in Europe, in Asia, built at distances multiples of 1,000 kilometers from Yaroslavl, and all of this was governed from Yaroslavl.
Communications and roads were built, so the empire gradually expanded and new territories were settled.
In the 14th century, the main event was the end of the confrontation between the two branches of Christianity.
According to the new chronology, there were no other religions at that time. They appeared later. In Christianity, there were 2 branches. The first branch was the royal Christianity, which believed that the reigning emperor and members of his family were gods, relatives of Jesus, and possessed divine authority. On the other hand, apostolic Christianity believed that the last god on earth was Jesus, and the reigning emperor was, at best, his representative, but did not have divine authority to take anything from anyone or give anything to anyone. Since apostolic Christianity provided better protection of property, the number of its supporters gradually increased.
The confrontation between these two religions ended at the Battle of Kulikovo, which was extensively discussed in this studio by Gleb Nosovsky. After that, Dmitry Donskoy, also known as Constantine the Great, moved his capital from Yaroslavl Third Rome to Constantinople. He actually built a city in his name on holy sites where Jesus was crucified, and Constantinople became the Fourth Rome.
However, there arose one contradiction, which a little later affected the life of the empire.
The resource base remained in the interfluve of the Uka and Volga, while the power shifted to the Bosporus.
And ultimately, this ended up the same way as when Jerusalem was captured.
In the 15th century, the main event was the onset of the so-called Black Death in Europe.
More precisely, the plague had existed before, but when there were no communications, the plague ended where it began.
That is, in some isolated area, city, or settlement, everyone died, and the plague did not spread further. But with the development of communications, the plague began to spread throughout the empire, particularly in Europe. To stop its spread, a decision was made to implement quarantine cleansing.
Most likely, the cause of the plague was the development of communications and the lack of proper medicine and prevention.
But on the banks of the Volga, they saw the cause somewhat differently. The point is, that in Europe, a bacchanalian cult of Christianity was practiced. That is, naked gods, various copulations, vestals, public banquets, and all this together naturally contributed to the spread of the plague.
And those who lived on the Volga decided that God was punishing them for believing incorrectly, and they had to be taught to believe correctly.
In connection with this, troops were sent out from the banks of the Volga to carry out the quarantine cleansing of Europe and its resettlement. That is, it was necessary to eliminate those who believed incorrectly. It's like the apocalypse, separating sinners from the righteous, destroying the sinners, and settling these territories with the righteous. These troops were led by Moses. Transferring the point of Exodus from Egypt to the banks of the Volga allows us to easily explain how Moses managed to cross the Red Sea, Sea of Reeds, as written in the English Bible, or the Black Sea in the Russian version. That is, the undertaking to destroy their own population was, in general, ambiguous, and therefore it had opponents. Moses's troops were pursued by those who wanted to hinder this mission. We know that the Easter holiday falls in spring, so Moses apparently managed to cross the frozen river, while those who pursued him got caught in the ice drift. And an ice drift in those times completely disrupted all communications. Therefore, Moses's mission did not end and he spent 40 years conquering Europe. However, I want to draw attention to something. We are told, a well-known fact, that Moses led his people through the desert for 40 years. By the way, why the desert? Because they were traveling through contaminated territory, carrying semolina with them and cooking it in collected dew. Thus, heavenly manna was obtained. 40 years of travel across the Sinai Peninsula. About a year ago, I was watching TV. Our oligarchs of the relevant nationality decided to repeat Moses's journey. They put on white clothes and set out. They completed this journey in 5 days. That's why, most likely, Moses didn't wander around the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years. But the new chronology version, that he spent 40 years conquering Europe, is quite possible. In 1453, the troops that marched out the banks of the Volga captured Constantinople, the fourth Rome. We also know this event by the biblical name, the Fall of Jericho. Let me remind you of the plot. Joshua approached Jericho and besieged it for a long time. He couldn't make any progress. Then he gathered all his warriors in one place, handed them horns, and made them blow. They all blew together and the walls fell down, because the Lord heard them and destroyed the walls. Almost the same thing, but using different horns called cannons, was done by Mehmed II in 1453 when he took Constantinople. He concentrated all his artillery in one place and pounded one point of the walls. As a result, he managed to destroy the walls of Constantinople and capture the city. This time, the former leaders of the empire fled from Constantinople to the Italian peninsula, where they founded Italian Rome. This is the end of the 15th century. Moreover, they had no military forces, but they had a desire to restore their power in the empire. Therefore, they began the first hybrid war in world history. The result of this hybrid war is the history that we are currently studying in school, where according to the new chronology, everything is turned upside down. In addition, in 1492, the Christian religion predicted the end of the world, which did not happen, and this provided an opportunity to strike, so to speak, at the societal bonds. The main societal bonds of the then empire were the Christian religion. These Vatican or Roman figures began to create new religions, Catholicism, Lutheranism, Protestantism, in order to shake the foundations of the empire. How did this ultimately affect the empire? They, in essence, won the hybrid war. They won in the following way. To understand how this happened, let's go back to the era of Ivan the Terrible, the 16th century. What do we know about Ivan the Terrible? We know that he was a madman, practically a schizophrenic, who abdicated the throne twice, forced the people to swear allegiance to him 4 times. He got married 6 times, without caring at all about how it related to religious laws and laws of succession. He would start something, like the Livonian War, and then end it himself, or quarrel with the church, then make up, start the Oprichnina, then end it. Overall, a very strange ruler. But they tell us, what can you expect from barbarians like you? You probably have everything like this. Having studied the era of Ivan the Terrible, the new chronology concluded that in reality 4 czars reigned in his era. These 4 czars were subject to different groups of influence and therefore took different actions. The first czar of the era of Ivan the Terrible was Ivan Vasilievich. During his reign, a rebellion in Kazan was suppressed. Then he fell seriously ill and after partially recovering, abdicated the throne. We also know him by another name, Vasily the Blessed, that is, Basil the Blessed Tsar. It's no coincidence that Vasily the Blessed is buried in the church built in honor of the capture of Kazan. The second Tsar of the era of Ivan the Terrible was the son of Ivan Vasilievich, Dmitry Ivanovich. He was a minor Tsar, so a guardianship council led by Adashev governed on his behalf. Under this guardianship council, under Adashev, the Livonian War began. What was the task? Essentially, after clearing the territories along the coast of the Mediterranean and Black Seas of all the bad people who didn't believe the right things, now it's the turn of the Baltic Sea. To combat heresies, troops were sent primarily in that direction. As is known, due to the negligence of the nannies, Dmitry Ivanovich died, was canonized, and was succeeded by Ivan Ivanovich, also the son of Ivan Vasilievich.
He grew up in the Zakharian Yuriev family, and when he ascended the throne, he found himself surrounded by the Zakharian Yuriev clan. The Zakharian Yurievs were representatives, as we could say now, of the West, of Europe. As is known, they secretly professed Protestantism. Therefore, firstly, they quarreled with the ecclesiastical authority in the center of the empire. Secondly, they stopped the Livonian War. And thirdly, wanting to strengthen their position near the throne, they began the so-called Oprichnina, a struggle for the destruction of their competitors, the ancient boyar clans. During this struggle, Novgorod the Great was sacked. As we know, this was the massacre of Novgorod. Moreover, they tell us that it was in Novgorod on the river Volkhov, but the new chronology considers it was in the Third Rome, Yaroslavl, Novgorod the Great on the Volga. To illustrate this, it would be interesting to note that in Yaroslavl, a strange situation arose where there are stone towers of the Kremlin, but there are no stone walls. Again, they explain this by our barbarism and the fact that the towers were built of stone, but the walls were wooden, and when the walls rotted, they were not rebuilt because the city was deep in the rear, and there was no need for walls. At the same time, in Moscow, for some reason, the walls were not demolished, but in Yaroslavl, they disappeared somewhere. Where did they go? They were demolished during the massacre of Novgorod, so that the city would never resist supreme authority again. Naturally, the old boyar clans were against such treatment, so civil strife arose, civil war, as a result of which, Ivan Ivanovich was removed from power, abdicated, and became a monk. As is known, after Ivan Ivanovich, Simeon Bekbaladovich ascended the throne, as the new chronology calls him Tsar Ivan Simeon. He is most likely a cousin of Ivan the Terrible. The empire began to recover after the civil discord.
After Simeon, his son Fyodor Ivanovich ruled. After Fyodor Ivanovich, his son Boris Fyodorovich, whom the Romanovs presented to us as Godunov, supposedly a new dynastic branch, completely illegitimate.
In fact, absolutely legitimate branch.
Boris Fyodorovich was poisoned. His son, Fyodor Borisovich, was killed. After that, Dmitry Ivanovich ascended the throne. He is the son of Ivan Ivanovich, not Ivan Vasilievich, and not an impostor, but a real active character from the imperial family, who had the right to the throne.
We also know him under the name Criminal of Tushino.
This story is well detailed in the historical study, Time of Troubles. He ascended the throne practically at the point of the European bayonet, held it for a year, then he was overthrown, and after that, the Time of Troubles begins, described in detail by Skrenikov.
The new chronology hardly disputes this description.
After the Time of Troubles began in Russia, the empire disintegrated into several parts. The main parts in the territory of Eurasia were New Europe, as it is called on European maps, including Muscovy, led by the Romanovs.
Turkey-Atamania or the Ottoman Empire.
Its territories are also known: the Persian Gulf, modern Turkey, North Africa, and so on. In general, a fairly large territory.
And Great Tartary, which we do not study in schools.
Its territory began from the Black Sea, included Astrakhan. Further along the Volga the border rose to Nizhny Novgorod, included Nizhny Novgorod, Kazan.
Then the border rose to the Ural highlands.
The capital of this country was in Tobolsk. This country included all that we now call Siberia, Central Asia under the name of Independent Tartary, half of China up to the Great Wall under the name of Chinese Tartary, as well as Afghanistan, Pakistan, half of modern India.
All this was Great Tartary,
and most of North America from the Pacific coast almost to the Mississippi River. This was the largest country in the world, described in the first British encyclopedia, published at the end of the 18th century. This country, Great Tartary, was defeated by military means. We know the war with Great Tartary under the name Pugachev's Wars. After that, the territory of this country was divided between Muscovy, led by the Romanovs, and finally we turned into the Russian Empire. Muscovy turned into the Russian Empire, and Great Britain, which got North America.
Further on, apparently, the actual history of the world is the same as in textbooks.
Essentially, I am now ready to answer questions.
312 says, Zadar is in Croatia, isn't it?
Zadar, I haven't looked at the map, I apologize.
7373948 is the number of the live broadcast by code 8495. SMS messages +7925 888 948. Alexander Feldman. Prince Ivan is the one who was killed?
If it's Prince Ivan Ivanovich, then yes. That's the one who was supposedly killed by Ivan Vasilievich with his staff.
Was the Bible written in Russian or Hebrew?
If we look at research, I read an interesting book about papyri, which says that the first medieval researchers of the Bible were very outraged and cursed. Why didn't the Lord find a better language than Greek to write the Bible? That is, the first Bibles were in Greek, so that the translation mostly came from Greek. Again, in this wonderful book about papyri, I read that perhaps even the phrase, et tu Brute, Caesar also said in Greek.
Even traditional historians also acknowledge this.
And one more question. Can it be said that, according to the authors of the new chronology, all modern chronology is the result of some awful and secret conspiracy of heretical West?
Not entirely, and not everywhere was it awful and secret. Sometimes out of ignorance, sometimes deliberately.
For example, the history of Rome was deliberately moved there. It was stolen from all previous Romes and moved to Italian Rome.
In particular, we know that there is the Colosseum and it's in Rome, but we don't know that there is also a Colosseum in Istanbul. But it does exist, right in the central square.
True, now it's a buried hill,
But the authors of the new chronology have been inside this Colosseum.
by the way,
There is a high school on that hill, and the key to this Colosseum is kept by the principal of the high school. Why do I say this?
firstly, there are mistakes. For example, how many names do you have?
Names?
How many names do you have?
Well, probably one.
1. That's not true.
You have a surname, first name, patronym, and people can address you by all three names. You're called something at home. Your husband calls you affectionately, your mom something else, friends call you one thing, enemies another. Plus, you have a profession, you're also a talk show hostess, so a modern person easily has a dozen names. And various emperors and medieval figures also had a huge number of names. Plus, texts were written with only consonants, and the vowels were added as desired.
So, by adding vowels, you'll get even more names. When history was being written in the 16th century, of course, there was a political agenda, but there were also honest mistakes. If you see histories of Ivan, Peter, and some other names, you have 5 histories but one timeline.
They need to be somehow aligned on this timeline.
These are names.
These are names, and along with them, events described slightly differently by various chroniclers. Trying to place them all on a unified timeline, and not understanding that it's the same event being talked about, like the 10 Crusades and the Trojan War. We've filled our history with them for who knows how many years.
7373948, please put on your headphones. We're listening to you. Hello.
Hello, my name is Georgi.
Georgi, please ask your question to our guest right away.
I have a question. Actually, I treat the new chronology as they say in Ukraine. Ukrainians invented the wheel. But my question is for the guest. Is he consciously involved in this matter, or does he receive some grants from abroad, particularly from America, for spreading all this nonsense?
There is conscious involvement, and there is, apparently, unconscious one. Ostensibly, with grants, it's somewhat unconscious. Please explain.
Yes, I understand. With grants, it's about a cash grab. No, I'm doing this for myself, without any grants. You see, when the director of the Library of Congress learned about the new chronology, he called it a very dangerous theory. So, apparently, we shouldn't expect any grants from America.
And as for nonsense, you know, it's a tricky thing.
Different theories are treated differently. Everyone thinks that the theory of relativity is a good theory, but at the same time, nobody knows it. Many people consider the new chronology to be nonsense, but at the same time, nobody knows it either.
First, study it. Watch at least 24 films that are available on the internet. I carefully read the Bible, all the Gospels I could get my hands on, and Skrinikov's works. In general, I've read a huge number of books. Naturally, I've been reading since childhood, and my whole life I've had this feeling.
Well, how could it be?
We have such a strange country.
Every czar in our history is some kind of freak, and every event is twisted somehow.
But when I encountered the new chronology, everything finally fell into place for me. I understood why such events happened under Ivan the Terrible, and where the biblical events took place, so, I understood a lot.
What was before the 16th century if the new chronology starts from the 16th century?
It starts approximately from the 10th or 12th century.
Alright, and what was before that?
Before that, there are only speculations.
In the new chronology there are no books about it, but there's a hypothesis that in the 6th century AD, there was a major volcanic eruption that destroyed the previous civilization. So, in the 6th century, there was practically a desert here on Earth.
080. Tough luck. Fyodor Ivanovich was born in 1557, but Boris Fyodorovich in 1552. Thus, the father is 5 years younger than his son.
We need to check.
This story was written. For example, Dmitry Ivanovich, who we know as False Dmitry. The Romanovs hid him under the name Grishka Otrepiev to conceal this branch that claimed the throne.
And they effectively rewrote the history related to Grishka Otrepiev.
Moreover, Shusky had a finger in the pie, explaining, "Do you remember that Dmitry Ivanovich who died and was canonized? That's not the same Dmitry Ivanovich." So, it's a battle, a war of histories, a local political struggle of that time, which is now written into our textbooks. It's possible and necessary to study how things really were, which is what the new chronology does by correcting these mistakes.
471st. What year is it now according to the new chronology?
2016. The thing is, Gleb Nisovsky already answered this question.
The new chronology doesn't create any eras.
For convenience, the new chronology uses an era calculated from the birth of Christ.
I just want to draw your attention that the questions are asked by the listeners. They might not have listened to previous programs, so I ask you to answer them.
I understand, but I still urge you to study the new chronology. You see, I live in a completely different world.
We, our wonderful liberals, our radio listeners, they live in a world where Russia, and in general, our country and our people, were born on the outskirts of history. That is, in Pompeii, they already had syphilis, ate pineapples, and perished in the year 79, and we do not appear till 900 years later.
In reality, it was not like that at all. And in order to understand the true, genuine role of the territory on which we live, in the interfluve of the Oka and Volga rivers, you need to study the new chronology. And then your world will change, and you will better understand what is happening to us.
7373948 is the number of the live broadcast. We are listening to you. Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Oleg, please your question.
How then to explain that according to the ancient Slavic chronology, it is now the year 7024? Can we dismiss everything? Is there no ancient Slavic culture that defeated Rome? Barbarians, Germans, Western, Eastern, Southern Slavs. How to make sense of this?
Everything is correct. The Slavs defeated Rome. I talked about this. First, they captured Jerusalem, then Rome, Constantinople. There's nothing particularly unusual about it. And as for antiquity and history, Gleb Nosovsky talked about it. He talked about the indiction chronology, how the era from the creation of the world was calculated and what errors it led to. You need to listen to previous broadcasts or read books. By the way, I would also like to draw attention to one fact that shocked me. Remember the book of Revelation? Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. If you translate the birth year of Jesus into the year from the creation of the world, it turns out to be the year 6660. The number of a man is 666. I remind you about Andronicus. So, through two such small details, the theory of the new chronology is indirectly confirmed.
Question from Marina B. From what year approximately do the official version and the new version coincide?
From the beginning of the time of troubles, they practically begin to coincide. From the ascension of the Romanovs, let's say, from 1613.
What is your opinion on Karamzin's history, specifically before Ivan IV?
I have talked about this history by Karamzin. Again, I remind you that our history was written by three remarkable Germans, Müller, Schlotzer, and Baer. It was written during the time of Peter the Great, who, there is suspicion, was actually substituted in Europe. Because, as we remember, he went abroad for several months but returned after several years. He left with a large number of people and a retinue but returned just with Menshikov. Without even reaching Russia, he sent his wife to a monastery, destroyed all his close circle. Also, without even reaching Russia, he suppressed the Streltsy uprising with the help of Polish troops. So, it was an obvious conquest. And during this conquest, the history of our country was written by three Germans. So, how should we treat this history? I believe it is incorrect.
Alexander Feldman. How does your chronology reconcile with the laws of demography? How did modern billions emerge from the remnants of the destroyed civilization of the late 6th century?
I've seen such a thing. Modern billions easily arise from two people over 1,000 years.
7373948 is the number of the live broadcast.
On this topic, there is research available. One can look into it.
Hello.
Hello, what's your name?
Valery.
Valery, go ahead with your question.
When I looked into the new chronology, it really clarified things for me, and I understood what's happening, for example, in Ukraine, and how history is being rewritten. But why do you think prominent scientists, historians, basically copyists, don't engage in dialogue? It's just intriguing.
This is a question for historians. Gleb Nosovsky talked about this, that when he and Anatoly Fomenko created their theory, they started with mathematics, and they came up with interesting dates for the birth of Christ and other events. They tried to offer these datings to historians, so that based on the discoveries they made, historians could create a new version of history. But historians didn't engage. They brushed off the new chronology, calling it insane. They don't intend to look at mathematical calculations.
Marina B. Do folk tales and epics confirm the new chronology?
If to put it briefly, partially. It's better to ask Gleb Nosovsky about this. He's an expert in this field.
Reply to 310th. Was Lenin real?
Read books, you'll find out.
Maybe visit the mausoleum?
Let them go to the mausoleum and see for themselves.
7373948. We're listening. Hello.
Hello.
What's your name?
I have a question about the Great Tartary. Why haven't typical coins for this state been found yet, so that they are spread across the entire territory of this remarkable state? Why aren't there any authentic objects? Anything that is characteristic of a civilization or some governmental structure?
Thank you. Well, I mean, a coin could still be found if one wanted.
The coin of Dmitry Donskoy is precisely the coin of Great Tartary. By the way, it's bilingual. It's written in Old Slavic on one side. So, the coins have been found. It's just a matter of how to interpret them. We're told that Dmitry Donskoy had to use two languages to mint his coins because he was under the Tatar-Mongol yoke. By the way, in 20 seconds, I hope I can also mention one more thing about Great Tartary. Look it up on the internet, the Great Trans-Volga Wall. This is a huge structure starting from Astrakhan and ending near Penza, 2,500 kilometers long. It's still not entirely clear who built it. There's a theory that it was built by Great Tartary.
Boris Kotovich, the president of the Foundation for Support and Development of the New Chronology, today presented a brief course of world history, but within the concept of the new chronology. Boris, thank you for coming.
Thank you.